Faith leaders and civil rights advocates are making a new push for reforms in racial justice and police accountability. Earlier this year, state legislators made progress toward a reform bill, but there has also been pushback, especially from police unions. To tell us about the new call for reforms in a petition to legislative leaders is the pastor of the new Roots AME Church in Dorchester, Mariama White-Hammond. Thank you very much for being with us, Reverend.
Thank you for having me.
Reverend, lately there has been a lot of national focus on this issue, but I guess we have concerns locally as well, between racial profiling statistics and even the DA's list of police officers who might have tainted credibility. So why do we need these reforms for what's going on here in Boston?
Yeah, so clearly this is a national problem, but it's also very much a Massachusetts problem. We are in the middle of a conversation in Boston around the case around Justin Root and what happened. Springfield is one of the only police departments in the country being investigated by the Department of Justice. The violations there are so egregious that the Department of Justice has continued to intervene. We have a lawsuit that just came out in Worcester around police assaulting a 10-year-old autistic boy. We've got folks in New Bedford who are still demanding answers around the death of a young man there. So this is not a problem elsewhere. This is a problem right here in the Commonwealth. And it's not just a Boston problem. This really is a challenge across the Commonwealth. And we think the time for reform is now. We shouldn't wait until we have a George Floyd. We don't want to, if we do something now, maybe we never have to experience what's happening in Kentucky with Breonna Taylor. The time for reform is really now.
It is easy to think in terms of the actions and the attitudes of responding officers on a call, but what about decisions that are made further upstream? And I think this mattered in the case of Breonna Taylor. What needs to be done about that in a reform bill for Massachusetts?
Right. So I think there's a few things. The first of all is that we need to have very clear standards. The standards are actually not clear from city and town to city and town. And so you can have a situation where citizens don't know their rights. And quite frankly, I wonder if all of the police officers are fully clear on what is allowed and what is not allowed. One of the things we're pushing for in this bill is a post commission, police officer supporting training. And that would include law enforcement folks, people who have an experience. But what we're also saying is it needs to include racial justice advocates, folks who are saying we need to be careful and we need to look at how we make our Commonwealth and our police officers more accountable, and particularly to communities of color. We think if we have the balance of those kinds of folks on this post commission, you have a real opportunity to set standards, to make sure every police officer and every police department knows what those standards are. And then if people don't follow those standards, we have a process by which they can be decertified as police officers. Because one of the other challenges we have, and we've seen this in a number of cases across the country, somebody commits an act in one community, maybe they don't even get fired, maybe they resign. But then they can just go to another community and just re-enroll as a police officer. They're often, their records from one community don't follow them to another community. So you can have very problematic officers that are able to just pick up and move to a new city and town without really being held accountable. Having a statewide post commission will ensure that we, again, set standards across the board, and that an officer can't just go from one community to the next if they've been deemed to be a problem. And clearly this is an issue. I mean, as you've seen, the other side of things is obviously the district attorney has a lot of control over how these cases are handled after the fact. We're really thankful to have a district attorney here who's paying attention to these issues and has tried to be much more fair and even-handed than has been in the past. She just released that report. There's more than 100 officers right here in Boston whose credibility is less than stellar based on acts of, in many cases, lying that they've already been caught in. That's a problem. And I don't think it's just a Boston problem. I think it's just that we have a district attorney that the people have asked to be much more serious in holding folks accountable. So there's a lot of work to be done right here in the Commonwealth. And I think it begins by setting very clear standards, holding everybody accountable to those standards, and having a system for removing police officers when they clearly violate.
Well, one obstacle to holding officers accountable is the amount of protection they get from qualified immunity. And that means the definition of what things that police officers know in advance are wrong is so narrow that it's really hard to pin them down. How would the state law change that? I mean, how should it change that without going too far in the other direction?
Right. So, you know, you've actually heard probably a lot of folks saying this bill will end qualified immunity. The reality is it will not end qualified immunity. What we are saying is there does come a point in which a person has violated so many rules, they should not continue to be protected. There are places where you clearly violated the agreements and the standards of your own department. And at that point, and we're not saying the first time, we're talking about serial violators should not continue to be protected from responsibility. And there's both criminal responsibility and there's civil responsibility. And it comes to a point where if you have a record of violence and recklessness, you should be able to be held accountable by the victims' families. Again, this is in pretty extreme cases. We're not talking about ending qualified immunity overall. We are just saying that there are some serial abusers and they should be held accountable.
Well, here in Boston, we do occasionally have these statistics about stops by police. The latest ones, I think they do show racial disparities in terms of who gets stopped, but we don't know why they were stopped. We don't know how productive these stops are. What needs to be done to get that under control?
Well, the first thing, Chris, is we have some of the data, but the reality is that overwhelmingly, most of the cities and towns in this Commonwealth are not reporting racial data at all. Even though there was a vote last year, I believe it was last fall, to require people to track limited data, it is still not happening. So that's one of the things, right? We need to follow the laws. Our law protectors and law enforcers got to follow the law themselves. And we agreed that we were going to track this. So I think that what we know now is just the tip of the iceberg. The data we have is concerning, but we don't even have all the data. And that's one of the other pieces of this bill, is that we're really trying to push for data, because if we can't tell how bad the problem is, how do we begin to address it? But yes, you're right. What they focused on in that bill was even more limited than many of us as advocates would like. We think that it would have been stronger if we were collecting more data, and we were collecting data on stops, you know, where people were still released. So I think that what the data does is allow us to see potential problems before they escalate to the kinds of situations we've seen across the country, and escalate to some of the kinds of situations we've seen right here in the Commonwealth. With Springfield, they have such an egregious history of excessive use of force. I think if we were beginning to hold them accountable and looking at their stops, looking at their frisks, we would begin to identify those police officers that are, I believe that the majority of them are doing the job, but there are a small number of police officers who are doing a lot of damage. And right now, our systems of accountability do not remove those police officers from duty.
Use of force in Noknock raids. We had a bad experience with that in Boston in 1994 involving the pastor, Reverend Asselin Williams. Do you think we've learned the lessons from that?
I think that Boston particularly, I think that there has been some improvement in that. I think that that was such an egregious situation that I think it caused the community to hold the police accountable, and I think the police have responded in general. I do think you always want to be careful, because unfortunately, human beings, we often tend to forget. And so something egregious happens for the next 10 years, you got people, they remember. But then if you don't put it in policy, the next group of police cadets that come in, they weren't here during that time. They don't know, they don't have the same experience. And so you have the possibility of backtracking in places where you've made progress.
Speaking of cadets, what about diversity in the police force? What needs to be done to get that more in line with the city's population?
Yeah, so one of the other things we're calling for is a civil service commission. And that really is looking at how are we deciding who gets into the police force in the first place? I think there are people out there that are perfect for this job. I think there are people out there that are absolutely should not be given a gun and allowed to enforce things. And lots of people in the middle, right? Where good training and good examples can make them into a good police officer. But the way it's currently set up, there's really only two things that are making the determination. One is if you're a veteran, you get such high priority. And then we have these tests, which the concern is there a real correlation between what people get on this test and how well they actually do in the field? What I want is to make sure that whatever we're using to determine who should be police officers are actually correlated in some way to what makes them good at their job, not whether or not they can fill in the right bubbles. And what we found is that with those two requirements, we're finding that there are fewer candidates of color who are able to make it through this system. We think that's concerning, particularly in communities of color, which have a history of racialized policing. It will make a difference if it's more possible for folks from that community to be engaged in enforcement in that community. So I think my concern is in some instances, these standards don't capture what it actually takes to do the job well. And so we really need to look at creating a system that gets us the best qualified people for the job in alignment with what we're actually asking them to do.
Well, thank you very much for taking the time to join us.
Thank you, and it's good to be with you. And I believe Massachusetts has taken leadership in so many other areas. We can do it here too.
Well, thank you very much. That was Mariama White-Hammond, Reverend Mariama White-Hammond, the pastor of New Roots AME Church in Dorchester.